And it's my great pleasure to be here. And I know you just said don't feel obligated to write down questions, but I'm going to tell you you should be obligated to, because I already know what I wrote. That's boring. So I love to give these talks to hear what other people have to say. So please let's make this a conversation. And I will just start first with a very brief introduction to how I came to write this book and some of the major findings. There we go. So here's my book. The genesis of this book is that my girlfriend was making very good cocktails during the pandemic. So one evening I had, two cocktails, and then I opened my computer and went to Twitter, which is a bad idea. Don't drink and tweet. And I saw a video of a man I ended up profiling for the book. His name is Mike Forcha. He's an indigenous activist in the Twin Cities. And he was throwing a loop of rope around the neck of a Columbus statue. And then I tweeted this, which got a lot of engagement, including Tucker Carlson said that I'm I command mobs of nihilists, which I have to say the only nihilists I know are my children. There they are. And they don't even listen to me about bedtime. So it sounds super cool to command mobs of nihilists. Not happening. What was much more interesting to me about the tweet was not just that it got so much response, but that, and by the way, I was wrong. The Statue of Columbus, it took about 2.5 pulls for it to come over. It turns out it wasn't secured to the base with anything. They just set it down there. Sort of the weight of the metal and of cultural history was easily overturned. Anyway, what was more interesting to me was that there were thousands of comments on my tweet with arguments back and forth about things that I thought were kind of settled, like people asking, what's so wrong about Columbus anyways? Or saying it's un-American to destroy a statue, or it's uncivilized. When I'm a classicist, right, my PhD is in Greek and Roman art, so basically everything that I have studied has been torn down and thrown away at some point. So I know that monumental change is a part of human history, that we tear down monuments at an almost equal rate as we put them up. And then I knew that not only is tearing down a monument not un-American, in fact, the very first metal monument that America ever had, a statue of King George, lasted for only 7 years before the Declaration of Independence was read and New Yorkers rioted, pulled it down, and melted it into lead that was used for bullets to fight King George's army. So I think maybe we should re-look at the history of American monuments to think of them as something that we use to get to the future we want to get to. Here you go. This is a very fanciful reconstruction of this monument. We don't even really know what it looked like, but it's always nice to have a picture. By the way, it keeps reviving. So after they pulled down the pieces, they took him by boat and then by ox cart to a foundry to be melted down into these bullets. Somebody, probably loyalists, who either wanted to protect the king or just have there be less lead available for bullet making because lead had been restricted the import into the restive colonies because they knew what it might be used for. So they pulled pieces of him off of the cart and threw him into fields and swamps where they have been recovered. So this piece of his tail is in the New York Historic Society, and this arm sold just a couple of years ago for more than $200,000, which really looks like it's a horror movie prop. You know, it should be shooting up out of a grave, but apparently somebody wanted it that much. Okay, so back to Tucker. Sorry, you have to look at him again. To the idea that he was speaking of in this piece was something that I think is still pretty fairly assumed commonly, that many of the statues that came down in the last few years were taken down by mobs or protesters. But in fact, I put together a very dorky spreadsheet tracking the fate of all of the removed statues I could find. So there have been 214-ish between these two dates, and only 20% of these came down during a protest. So the vast majority of these removals were made by authorities, local authorities. Some of them acting to protect the monuments because there were ongoing protests. Some of them were put in storage and then have already been put back up now that there's less protests. Many of them, most of them were by authorities who agreed with the public change of ideas of who should be memorialized and have removed them. The thing that really made me want to start writing this book was I kept reading all of these news stories about the removal of monuments, and they would all end with the statement that the monument was loaded into a truck and then the truck drove off. And I kept thinking, but where's the truck going? What's happening to those monuments once they're off their pedestals? And I think in the public imagination, again, the idea is, oh, they've been all melted down, destroyed. But no, I'm showing you here the sole image that is no longer available for view after the Black Lives Matter protest, which is it's like a serving platter-sized image of Columbus on the side of a monument, not even a monument to Columbus, but a monument to Italian-American immigrants. He's just like a tag-along monument. So he was thriftily chipped off and they inlaid the Italian and the American flags in the place so they wouldn't have to replace the whole monument. That's it. All the rest of the monuments are still out there. Many of them were just simply moved from one place to another, so a slightly less prominent public location, like a historic cemetery instead of in front of the courthouse, for example. Others were given back to the groups that had donated them, like the Italian American Heritage Foundations or the United Daughters of the Confederacy or the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And so those groups are free to put them on their private land. They can still be very visible. A few, very few have ended up in museums, unsurprisingly, because everyone I talk to who works in a museum says we do not have the space or funding to store these things. My favorite comment was from the director of a museum who said, museums are not America's attic for racist history. And then a lot of them are just in storage, just waiting for determinations of their fate. So I think there's still a lot of room for public opinion, for a democratic process of what do we want to have happen to monuments that are standing and what do we want to have happen to monuments that are in storage. Right now we're paying for them to be stored, so we should have some opinion in it. Why did I put in Davis? Let's see. I don't know, but here's a nice photo of Davis being taken down. So another thing that I found while doing the research for this book, which was pretty depressing, is that there has been, along with this public swell of opinion about we need to change monumental spaces, there's been an equal, if not greater, backlash of efforts to make it even more difficult to remove a public monument that is existing. So there are many states that have laws on the books saying you can't remove any Confederate monument or any public monument at all. And many more states have proposed these laws since. It also made me think of what does it mean to pull down a monument during a protest if there is in fact no legal, no peaceable means of making your opinion about that monument known. If you can't even raise the question, protest becomes one of the only ways in which you can act. So when I talked to Mike Forcha, here he is throwing the rope, this is what I learned, that he has been protesting this monument of Columbus for his entire adult life, for decades and decades. He has filed multiple petitions, followed the procedure that he was told to go to this particular committee, and it was only once the statue came down that the Minnesota state authorities admitted that there was in fact no procedure for considering removal requests, that all of his petitions had just been thrown away. So even in states where there is some established procedure for asking for removal of monuments, this very rarely happens. Oh, here's more of the Columbus coming down. You can see here. I like he had one hand pointing to the New World, and when he came down, he kind of rotated there. He's like, oh, I'm discovering the ground. Mike Forcha did not himself pull the ropes. He took all responsibility for the removal, but he handed the ropes to Indigenous women, saying that this is the group that suffered the most because of colonization of the Americas, and they should have the sort of first tug on the rope. So here he is, a state trooper was dispatched to hand him the statute that said, here's who's in charge of monuments. And he is saying, I've already gone that route. There's Columbus on the ground. He was, I wanted really to interview him because he was among the only people who not only took responsibility for taking down a monument in the last couple of years during a protest, but who were known to have done so. He was very deliberate about this. He heard there were rumors going around that the statue was going to be toppled at night, and he decided he would risk jail time, he would risk being held financially accountable for the damage to the statue to take it down in the day, because he thought this statue went up in the daytime with crowds of people cheering. It needs to come down with equal ceremony and equal public awareness. The prosecutor agreed to divert his case to a special talking circle idea of justice, derived actually from Indigenous models. So members of the community had conversations over the course of months, both about the harm done by taking down the monument and also the harm that the monument had done in the community. And they sentenced him to community service of going to schools to educate them about the oppressive nature of colonialism and of the statue. So he's been very happily, extra serving this since then. So even in places that do have a procedure for removal of monuments, this very rarely happens. What I'm showing you here is an image from about 6 years ago, I think in New York City, a protest about this monument in the background. This was a monument on Fifth Avenue across from Medical Library, a portrait of J. Marion Sims, who was a doctor known as one of the fathers of gynecological surgery. He invented a procedure that is still in use today to combat childbirth injuries. Great, except for he did so by repeatedly experimenting on performing surgical operations on unanesthetized enslaved women. So really pretty disgusting. There was nobody in New York City who was raising their hand and saying, yes, let's keep up that monument. But it still took years of protest by community members, doing very vivid works of, I would say, performance art, not just protest, to point out the disgustingness of having this monument in a very honorable place in the city. And so New York did convene a committee to consider controversial monuments in 2017. And so they took 6 months, many thousands of comments received, many public hearings. And after those 6 months, they took down this one statue of Sims. He's now in storage. But they did not take down any of the other monuments that were put up for consideration, including a number of Columbus monuments. And then here I'm showing you this picture from during the Black Lives Matter protests. This Columbus Circle, Columbus was ringed with barricades, had a 24/7 police guard. And I kept thinking, to protect from what? He's like 5 stories up in the air. What is Spider-Man gonna come and knock him over? But whatever. someday I will do FOIA requests and find out how much police overtime was spent on protecting statues in New York City. But well, someday. Okay. Oh, so here is what I was telling you before, that 18 states have proposed upping the criminal penalties for demonstrating against vandalizing a monument, and 13 have proposed laws that would make official removal more difficult or outright impossible. My favorite / least favorite of these proposals is Alabama has proposed raising the fine for removing a monument, which they needed to raise. There was already a fine of $25,000 because the state legislature knew that there were certain communities that did not want their Confederate monuments anymore. So the state was trying to ensure those remained in place until Birmingham, Alabama became the very first public official removal of a monument just days after the murder of George Floyd, because its mayor is like, yeah, we can pay $25,000. Get it out of here. So now Alabama is like, okay, we need to do more. Here's the deal. For even voting to approve the removal of a monument, this legislative proposal, which is so far not passed, an official would be subject to a fine of $1 million, which always makes you think like $1 million if you don't like the Confederacy. And there is this idea that we shouldn't be destroying history. We can talk more about that as we discuss. But I would like to point out that many of these public monuments that have become controversial are really very recent. So here is Stone Mountain, which is the world's largest Confederate monument. It's just outside of Atlanta. And it is sort of treated as if it were made just after the close of the Civil War. But no, here it is during its dedication. It's being dedicated by Spiro Agnew. People were pissed that Nixon didn't show up. He was supposed to be the dedicator. So there's all the press photography is like, who is this guy? But this is 1972 in which it's dedicated. And I think, you know, my grandparents have shag carpeting that's older than Stone Mountain. And it'll just be okay. We'll not be destroying priceless historical remnants if we just, especially because these monuments continue to attract the same sort of ideology, the same sort of behavior that they were meant to encourage. Stone Mountain was a project begun in 1914. The Klan was very much involved throughout the first couple of decades of its creation. Why? Because they rightly realized they could embezzle a lot of money from donations. And then the project went dead because they embezzled too much. It was only revived when the governor of Georgia bought the land in 1958 for the state, made it into a state park, relaunched the monument project. Why? Because he wanted Stone Mountain to serve as a rallying point, he said in a press release, for people who were resisting Brown v. Board of Education. So this was a site that was born as a white supremacist ideology image. It grew up as a white supremacist ideology. So it's no surprise that it continues to be used as a point for assembly of white nationalism now. So on the upper left, this is a photograph from 2017. There was a white nationalist rally on top of Stone Mountain just weeks after the Dylann Roof's murderous spree in the Mother Emanuel Baptist Church. And then here, this is just last year, another rally of Sons of Confederate Veterans at the site. I was unfortunately not able to attend, but I did hear from those who were there that the protesters more or less outnumbered the Confederate supporters and kept shouting, "Incel losers" at them. So there's a public reversal of whose interpretations of the site are most supported. As you can see today, actually the monument is harder to read. It's even harder to see now. This was during the Black Lives Matter protests. What did I take out? Oh, now here it was last year. Sorry for the ridiculous selfie of me. But it's become hard to look at, not emotionally, but literally hard to look at, because on the top of this mountain here are little pools, pits in the rock in which an endangered species of shrimp lives. And so the runoff, you can see streaking down the mountain, stains the carving. And so before 2020, every half decade or so, they had to clean it off so you could see it. So I just like the idea that runoff shrimp shit is obscuring the glory of the Confederacy at Stone Mountain. But I tell you this also because they're currently debating whether or not to spend the money to clean this monument. And they have said, the association that's in charge of the memorial has said it would be $500,000 to carry out this cleaning. So the memory of the Confederacy is not free. The memory of all of these things that we are considering, again, is often a public expense to keep up these monuments. So the status quo costs us. Now, what can we do to show that our ideas about the figures honored in these memorials or what these memorials are doing have changed? A lot of people will say, let's put up some signage. Let's contextualize it. As an academic, I love the idea of signage. I love the idea that everybody will carefully consider a written sign, but studies that look at what people actually do when confronted with information about someone that they want to idolize, they just ignore it. Even in the best of cases, people don't read the signage too much at museums, so if you're trying to convince them that their hero is somehow problematic, it's just not really going to happen, which I think isn't surprising because words on a sign, that just affects a different part of our brain than images. And monuments are made to be bigger than us. They're made to be up on pedestals, so we're looking up at them. They're shouting out that this is something that the community should admire. So if you want to change that message, I think you need to do it in a visual way and in an unmistakable way. So I think one of the great pities of the results of the Black Lives Matter protests is that all of these visual interventions on statues have been scrubbed off. Because if you see this, you can't read this monument as unproblematically the community all agrees that this person should be honored. No, you stop and think, wait, why should we or should we? There's a great tradition of this type of intervention in monuments. I'm showing you here a statue of Lenin in Berlin that after the fall of the wall, there's various artistic interventions here dressed up as a shopper. So it's someone pushing a shopping cart full of consumer goods to sort of question what the effect of the end of communism has been. Shortly after this, by the way, that statue of Lenin was disassembled. The parts where it's a very hard, very durable granite. So the city took the parts and buried them in a sand pit in a forest outside of Berlin. And then a decade or so ago, they dug back up the head to put it on display in a museum exhibition. It was supposed to be temporary, but then people thought it was cool. So now if you go to Berlin, I highly recommend a museum just outside of the city center in Spandau, the Citadel Museum, which is a museum full of monuments that have been removed from Berlin for various reasons. There's Nazi monuments, communist, Prussian militaristic, and what's the best thing about this museum is that you can touch all of the monuments. So Lenin's head is laying sort of on his side and you can actually climb on top of it. My children had a great time like using his nose for nostrils as handholds to get up there. But it really makes you think about what is your normal relationship to a monument and what can change it. So I showed you the Columbus and said that's the only monument that's been irrevocably destroyed that isn't ready for redeployment, which, again, I just can't believe how much effort we're spending to save all these things. Like, I sometimes joke it's like America's strategic racism reserve, like just in case we need some more racism. We can pull these things out. But it may be soon that Columbus is not the only one. So this is the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, the statue that was at the center of the deadly Unite the Right rally in 2017. It's a statue that is in one of the works in this lovely exhibition. Confederate statues are for the birds. And it stayed on its pedestal until just a little over a year ago because some local, they called themselves the Monuments Fund, but some Confederate heritage supporters sued the city of Charlottesville when the city had announced not a plan to remove the statue. They announced in 2016 a plan to move it to even another downtown park, just a little farther away. The Monuments Fund didn't like that. They sued. That lawsuit lasted for many years. And then finally, the lawsuit ended. Virginia state law changed to give municipalities greater control over their monuments. And they took it off its pedestal, put it in storage. And the city announced that they would give the monument, along with a Stonewall Jackson statue from the same period, to people who would propose some projects to reuse the statues in a way that would fight the lost cause mythology. So the Lee statue, which is made in 1924, again, not ancient history, went to the Jefferson School, which is a local Black history nonprofit, to do what they are calling the Swords into Plowshares project. So they proposed to use this bronze, melt it down, and then commission an artist to work with the community to make a new monument that will better reflect Charlottesville's current state of affairs, or even its past state of affairs. Jillian Schmidt, the UVA professor, who is one of the leaders of Swords into Plowshares, will often say that the statue was alive from the time it went in, because at the close of the Civil War, the majority of citizens of Charlottesville welcomed the Union troops. Why? Because 52% of those who were living in Charlottesville at the close of the Civil War were enslaved until the Civil War. So the idea that Lee was venerated, was the hero of the majority of people of Charlottesville, has never been true. But this project, it took about 2 weeks before a new lawsuit was launched to stop the melting down. That claim was very funny to me as a lawyer, because the plaintiffs there, they didn't know what the status of the statue was, had it been melted down or not. They wanted to be awarded the statue for their own uses. These are Confederate heritage groups with sites in Virginia. But they said, if the statue's already been melted down, dear judge, please compel the city of Charlottesville to use the metal to be formed into Civil War cannon that we can display. And they didn't say replica Civil War cannon, they just said Civil War cannon like it was a time-traveling arts and crafts project. But that lawsuit is in the very last stages of being resolved. So just, keep your eye on the news about what will happen to Lee soon. But it's another sign of the resistance to monumental change, that anytime you see something, a proposal to even put up signage, there will be resistance. There will be media outcries, there'll be social media, there'll be protesters and counter-protesters. And so I think the one message to take away from that is that people will protest if you put up a sign suggesting that Robert E. Lee is not a saint, but they'll also protest if you melt them down. So you know what? You might as well go for a more creative, a more definitive statement of change rather than thinking that anybody will still be comfy with just a little bit of change. Okay, so that's it. Let's have a conversation.
Thank you, Erin. Great presentation, and I very much enjoyed reading your book this summer. One question I have for you, so the examples that you've been showing here today, and you've been talking about them from sort of a political, social stance, and very easy to, I think, differentiate, the Confederate, the controversy around Confederate statues. What I didn't hear you talk about was perhaps the artistic value of any of those, and if that comes into play at all in your research or how things are being perceived that way.
Yeah, it does to me. Well, it does and it doesn't. I think, if the Mona Lisa gave a fatal electric shock to every 100th person who visited it, we wouldn't need to display it. So artistic value only goes so far in terms of deciding how harmful a monument is. But I have to say that a lot of the monuments that are controversial are not that aesthetically valuable. This one, for example, was commissioned from the famed public sculptor Henry Schrady, who has great works, both Union and Confederate, but he died in the middle of making the model for this. So his assistant took over the project, and nobody is saying he did a great job of it. But even at the time this was true, so my favorite fact that I found out during my research about this statue is that when photographs of the model first circulated, a Confederate veteran wrote into a Virginia newspaper just tearing the statue apart and saying that doesn't look anything like Lee, and also it doesn't look anything like his horse. So there's a whole mythology of Lee's horse, Traveler, and then this veteran wrote in this indignant letter to the editor, Traveler was not a horse to put on airs. So apparently it was too prancy a horse. But at least this was an individual statue. Many of the Confederate monuments that are standing were mass-produced, more or less. They were cast in molds. A lot of them are made out of zinc rather than even bronze. I don't know if you remember it in Durham, one of the first times a Confederate monument was taken down during protests. This was back in 2017. I recommend you watch the videos because the protesters put ropes around it and they settle in. They're obviously like, this is going to take a lot of effort, and it doesn't even fall off the pedestal. It's pretty well secured. It just goes like boop because it's hollow and zinc. Mm. And so there's this moment of surprise on everybody's faces, like we did not expect that to happen. So yeah, these are mass-produced propaganda, we would call them in any other country. Rather than artistic masterpieces in most cases. And I think museums are more willing to take on pieces that do have more artistic or historic value and try and recontextualize that. But there's a lot of stuff that's just we don't need that one,
So you were gracious enough to come to our department today, and where we discussed our statue in the Alumni Hall, the statue of George Washington. And I would like to kind of circle back to that a little bit because there's sort of 2 points. One is the aspect of universities, and university owns kind of sculptures and monuments, and our responsibility there, and our opportunities, our challenges there. And also the more challenging aspect of George Washington, right? There are the presidents that were slaveholders, and but also very great men for many reasons. But you sort of mentioned the if Mona Lisa had done electric shock. So what's our threshold? What is our threshold for saying somebody's evils outweigh their good points?
Right. Well, first that reminds me, so the figure I gave of number of removed monuments, that was for public monuments, figural monuments. There have been a lot more, street names renamed or just plaques taken off. And then there's been a whole other set of privately owned or university grounded monuments. I kind of cheated not looking at even public universities, but I was like, I have enough to deal with. So universities have been really interesting because I think there is often an agreement that there should not be something prominently on campus that causes pain to many students, but there's also a lot more hesitation about, are we erasing this history? Should this be a teaching tool instead of just erasure, et cetera? So I think universities have been slower to move, but it is happening. So for example, Washington and Lee University, which is really a double-barreled challenge of legacy there, is working to do really interesting things to change the presentation of both those figures on their campus, and to do so in a way that doesn't deny how long they carried water for the lost cause mythology, for example. So about presidents, this is another advantage of writing a book. You can decide what you want to talk about. And so there's not too much George Washington in my book because I'm like, I don't know. But I think one principle that I do have when I'm coming to these discussions is that I really don't care about who is in the monument. I think a lot of these public debates are about like putting the person who's honored in the monument on trial. Were they good? Were they good enough? I am, as an art historian and an object-focused person, much more interested in the history of that object itself and in the current usage of the monument. So I don't care who's represented on Stone Mountain. I care that it was used in a way to further oppression and that it still encourages that type of ideology now. Whereas an interesting counterexample is the Lincoln Memorial. So Lincoln, problematic white savior representations of Lincoln, including very much in the Lincoln Memorial, which very much shows him as freer of people rather than acknowledging the reality, which is that a majority of Black men in America during the time of the Civil War fought for the Union in order to, get their own freedom for those and others in the country. So, and the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial is also very interesting. It was a segregated ceremony. Even very honored Black invitees had to sit in the back rows. But because of the use of the steps of the Lincoln Memorial by King, by so many others, it has become transformed by use, I would say, into a site of empowerment rather than a continuing reminder of the sort of subordinate place that both white Southerners and white Northerners wish that Black Americans would have in history. So I think looking at how a monument is used today is really valuable. But sometimes how a monument is used today is to be ignored. When I went to Stone Mountain and I took that picture, I was astounded because it's still the most popular tourist site in Atlanta. It has millions of visitors a year, but most of them are not there for Stone Mountain, for the Confederate carving. They're there for the animatronic dinosaurs that are in the theme park that is now at the base of Stone Mountain. If you have not been, I highly recommend. It is very bizarre. And it's an incredibly diverse crowd because Atlanta is an incredibly diverse city. And I was sitting on that lawn thinking if those Confederates up there could see over the lawn, they would be horrified. But talking to people in Atlanta and hearing what people thought the monument represented, that they thought it was so old and blah, 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 there's almost nothing in a huge display about the monument, about the Klan. There's one sign with 113 words that you have to squat down in the bottom corner of a display that sort of mentions the Klan. I tweeted it, and one of my followers said, no Klansmen were offended during the writing of this signage. And so now that whole display is being renovated, and hopefully they will address these realities. But I think there's a difference between ignoring a monument because you don't realize what it is that you're ignoring versus knowing the harm that it represents, the history it represents, and deciding to overcome that by your ignoring it, if that makes any sense. So I think, having a big conversation about the history of an object and how it has been used is really important. And in fact, I think the only thing to do, right? Because some people assume that if, all monuments, all Confederate monuments, or all Washington, or all Columbus monuments, if they could disappear tomorrow, that would be great. But I think that taking a monument down without a conversation of why it went up is more harmful than having it remain there unchanged, because that's ignoring that history.
So ignoring the history, I'll go back to that. The idea that that taking the statue down erases history. Does that erase history? What history does it erase, right? That's kind of...
Right. I saw somebody joking on Twitter that their back was always sore because they were a history professor and they had to carry all the monuments to class to teach history. There's so many ways of teaching history that don't require these monuments. Monuments, in fact, if you think that it's erasing history, I encourage you to go and stand in front of a monument you're worried about and think, well, what is it teaching me? Because, as Professor Lynch pointed out, you have to know the story to read a monument. They're not very good at teaching anything. And then a quote that I put into my book was from an Indigenous woman historian saying, if you want to know what erasing history is like, ask an Indigenous woman. So she doesn't even know the names of her grandmothers because they are of so little interest to American authorities that they just are not recorded. There was, for many generations, an attempt to remove Indigenous children from their families so they wouldn't learn the stories, they wouldn't learn the religion, the myths, the history, their language, anything. And all of that, or much of that, has still survived. So you can't erase history from people who don't want to lose that memory. So I'm not so worried about erasing history by taking down monuments. I am more worried about erasing the memory of complicity, to know who did we honor for so long. That's a bit harder to retain, but I think there are ways of doing that.
So I circle back again to our presidents, and I know that there are, again, other universities who have this same issue in their namesake. And we talked this afternoon, showed images of University of Washington, where in 2020 students actively protested against the George Washington statue there. And I don't believe that has been removed, but they've allowed students to continue to engage with it as an art project, in essence. And so I basically kind of want to talk about the value of political activism as opposed to removing it. And is there, is it better to keep something up and be actively engaged with it on a political stance, or to have it be removed?
Right. But first, a little anecdote that New York City took down a statue of Thomas Jefferson from the city council chambers because a number of city council members had said, I do not want a slaveholder looking over all of my actions. And a local news station interviewed me about it, and I said something like, we can no longer unquestioningly glorify our founding fathers. And then Stephen Colbert read out that quote and said, then my identifier, and like said a professor at John Jay College. So like, okay, fair. And I didn't choose the name of the college, but yeah, we've got a lot of ways to go. Now I've entirely lost what I was going to say. The value of activism. So, this is where I started thinking that let's keep things in place so we can continue to rub up against them so they can be a reminder. And then now a few times I've heard people say, yeah, well, let's think about who is forgetting, who needs a reminder. Because there are a lot of Americans who do not need a reminder of racial oppression. They get that reminder every single day. So should, say, I advocate for the Statue of Lee to stay up so that my children don't forget the memory of the Confederacy. Well, that's a benefit to my children that that children of others are going to have to suffer the pain of seeing the glorification of an oppressor every day. So again, I think this is a community by community decision. There's no one size fits all answer. It's what is going to serve this community and the members of this community. And so it really needs to be a public decision about public monuments, which is kind of a misnomer for a lot of our public monuments now. They were not put up through any sort of democratic process. It was people who are rich enough to pay for a monument and powerful enough to ensure that it got a place in public. So now we have the opportunity to finally have an actual democratic conversation about the pros and cons of these objects.
Although if it's a minority that it's affecting and you have a public dialogue about it or a vote, it might not be the minority that rules out, right?
Right. But I think that the people need to understand the pain of others, which is something I see discounted a lot in these discussions of like, oh, you're being oversensitive. So there are people like Chelsea Carter, who's a professor at Yale, studying the actual physical effects that the sort of stress of seeing monuments like this every day can have on different groups of the population. So it should not need to like require a study to show that this can have a harm, but unfortunately to become part of the debate, it seems like we need reminders that other people have different perspectives on things.
So should we have monuments at all?
So the book is dedicated to my daughter, and it says just for Stella because I wussed out on my first version of the dedication, which would have been for Stella, who is bored by monuments, and that's probably a good thing. Because I don't think, sometimes I joke that they should all be melted down and turned into slides so that my kids could actually enjoy a trip with me anywhere as opposed to now. But I'm not the only one to think this. So one of the scholars I was very influenced by is Friedman Murray, who published in 1916, I believe, a book on he looked for all the representations of Black people in public art in America, which in 1916 was not a lot. And he said that, as is still often true of subsequent generations of public art, that these representations showed Black Americans like white Americans wished that they would be rather than as they were. So as a sort of, subservient, obedient underclass, even when they were shown, participating in the Revolutionary War, for example. And Murray took up the question of, well, if we do have monuments that commemorate emancipation, commemorate Black service in the Civil War, what should they be like? And he came out with the idea that showing any particular one person was too limited because everyone is complicated. He wouldn't have said that, but that's essentially what he meant. Like everybody's got good and bad, so you shouldn't just idealize just one person. And he said that monuments should be allegorical figures. And it's 1916, so that's sort of the most abstract you can get. But I think since then, we have had so many monuments or other artworks by completely abstract artists, Maya Lin, We have monuments that are gardens, that are beams of light, that are big silver beans, whatever. There are many ways to play on, to encourage a sort of upswell of pride and aspiration and togetherness through the use of art that isn't just some dude on a horse. It's just like a dude that we want to see on the horse, which is a bit frustrating to me. Like, I would love to see monumental change result in more creative solutions, whereas a lot of, again, the debate seems to be which dude should we put up on the horse? Like, let's take down Lee and put Harriet Tubman up on the horse. Like, it doesn't have to be a horse. It can be a huge variety of things.
I think we might turn to some questions.
Yep.
Okay, I've got, maybe we can gather some from the audience. Do we have some here from anyone? Okay, great, that's wonderful. If you get any more from this side, oh, great. How many's over to Mary? Take a look through.
Thank you.
We've got about 20 minutes.
If I can read the writing here. What are your thoughts on what makes for successful ways of representing history and memory today?
Well, I'll interpret this as successful to me because I'm feeling egotistical right now. I mean, again, I think this should be a community thing, but to me, a monument should not be a pledge of allegiance. It should make you ask questions. And that is something that very few of them currently do. It's almost like they're designed to shut off inquiry as opposed to carry it forward.
Do you see a difference between the statuary kind of monuments and monuments that are embedded in a place and an event, and the kind of artifacts that might present themselves in those kinds of monuments?
Yeah, I find that much more interesting. The sort of the work that is like here, the Freedom Riders Memorial, which is involved with the history of a place rather than just popping a Columbus wherever. But I think that can be difficult to create a new monument because people do expect figural representations, portrait statues. So the more successful projects I have seen to create new monuments or memorials have been really the result of community dialogue, where instead of just sort of dropping an artist commission into a place without any discussion with the people who are there, then that's when you get a lot of controversies. This is too abstract, this is ugly, etc. So yeah, I think public monuments should be public. Again, it needs to be a conversation, a democratic thing rather than but it can be a democratic thing that isn't just, the least common denominator of a boring portrait statue.
Could you compare what happened to U.S. monuments with what happened to Soviet statues post-1991?
This is a really interesting question because Soviet statues are still being removed. It's an ongoing dispute. I think it's actually more complex now that there's sort of Soviet nostalgia among many. So it's more comparable to the situation in the US now. But I think in the immediate fall of the Soviet rule, especially in the Soviet satellite states, there's a great happiness with the end of the Soviet rule, and statues came down because people wanted to change who was honored. They wanted to change what idea of the past was upholding what idea of the future. And so the fact that, for example, Confederate monuments are still being fought over so much in the US is, I think, a sign that the Civil War really isn't over. That the dispute about who should hold power in America that was at the heart of that war is still ongoing. And the reason why it's come back so heavily, this argument in the last couple of years, is because we are having, again, real disputes about who should hold power. Should it be a diverse group of people, or should it be the same people it always has been? So I think these disputes over monument are proxy fights for other larger social questions.
What is a lost cause mythology?
Oh, sorry, to be all technical about, it's just because like I could go on for forever now about Southern history. Like compressing. Let's see. After the end of the Civil War, white Southern elites, male culture had been built around the idea of honor, manliness, success, etc. So to be a loser was a real turnaround, and to be a loser who fought for something shitty was even worse. So in the decades after the Civil War, there was a sort of effort to reconceive what the war had been about. And was it fair for the North to have won, or was it just overwhelming, technical power, and the Confederate Army were valiant fighters, et cetera, that were fighting for states' rights, not for slavery. So this was the lost cause idea, that the South had been fighting for this lost world of honor, and that they should be, they weren't traitors, they were really fighting for the Union, a turning around. So you'll still see this today with people either just still claiming that the Civil War was not about slavery, or saying, okay, maybe it was back then, but these monuments are honoring my Southern heritage, my ancestors, and either, my ancestor didn't own people, or they had, nothing to do with that part of the war. So it's like the lost cause is a shorthand for trying to change the moral understanding of what the Civil War is about.
Okay. How should the memory of artists such as Jacques David, who worked for cruel, controversial, and evil governments, be preserved in culture? And I'm sorry, I can't read this. Is anybody, the question? I can't read I'm sorry, I can't read the handwriting.
Right, this is a very interesting question that I sort of have gotten around having to answer, because the monuments themselves are so intense. But I do think that when we're investigating a monument, we should look into the artists, not as an automatic, like, that person thought like one anti-Semitic thought in their life, therefore let's melt down all their monuments. No, but I think it's more subtle than that. Like, if I know that someone like Gutzon Borglum, who's this first sculptor of Stone Mountain, was a virulent anti-Semitist, I start to think, what ideologies is he encoding in his statues that I should think about? Like, are those ideologies still there? So, by the way, Gutzon Borglum was fired by the Klan because he was embezzling too much of the money that they wanted to embezzle. All he had finished was to carve a head of Lee in the mountain, and they blasted it off the mountain before they hired another sculptor to carve his own head of Lee at a reduced scale. So, like, if we take Lee off of Stone Mountain, he won't even be the first giant Lee to be gone from there. But then after they fired him, Borglum went on to get a new gig. He defected back to the Union and carved Mount Rushmore. So I really think we need to take a look at that one. I mean, I'm not the only one who thinks that, but as a more subtle example, like Thomas Ball, who was the sculptor who made a monument that is still standing in DC, Lincoln Memorial, where Lincoln is standing, sort of not even making eye contact, just like handing the Emancipation Proclamation to a nearly naked Black man who's like, oh yes, thank you, white savior. Ball, in his memoir, writes about carving that statue. He did so when he was in Florence. And he writes that he had hired a Black model for the kneeling figure. But at the time, his studio was in one room of his apartment, and it was too unpleasant to conduct the model through his apartment to get to his studio. So he fired that guy and just carved the statue after himself. He writes about this because he was very proud about the system of mirrors he set up so he could like see his own abs or something. I don't know. But once you read that, you think, okay, this is not accidental that this figure is shown as cringing, is shown absolutely ahistorically. So yeah, I do think it's worthwhile looking into the lives and opinions of the artists to spot things that might not be so evident if we think they had the best intentions.
Why do you think institutions like Miami hold on to statues of oppressive figures by no-name artists that are often ignored in their buildings?
I keep thinking about this. If anybody has better ideas, please let me know, because I fundamentally don't really get it. Like, there is a statue that I've been thinking a lot about in Tompkins Square Park in New York. Next time you're in the East Village, check it out. It's Thomas. Am I getting his first name right? But his last name is Cox, C-O-X. And it has carved on it, "Friend of the Postman." I'm like, nobody knows who this guy is. You really have to Google to get down. He got better rights for postal workers, like a reasonable work week. He helped form the Coast Guard. Okay, great things. Also, my dude, as a Northern senator, voted against the Emancipation Proclamation because he thought that the freed people would come and steal all the jobs from white New Yorkers. Not a cool dude to have in the East Village, one of the most diverse areas in the most diverse city. And also, the statue just sucks. Like, when they put it up in the late 19th century, even the New York Times is like, not the sculptor's best work. And if you find a picture of this dude looks like 3 toddlers in a trench coat. It is real bad. And yet somebody expressed discontent on social media. So he too had 24/7 police guard through 2020. One local newspaper dubbed the barricades that went up around him "Cox blockers." But there's this whole idea that bronze lives matters seems to apply to any statue. Like, you get your home free once you're up on a podium. No one can ever touch you. And it's just, there's an American exceptionalism about this too, I think, because we have just had a couple of lifetimes without having big changes in statues. And, I talk to Europeans, they're like, what is the big deal? Just take down some money. It's something you do. And we've kind of forgotten how common that is. And it's always easier to keep the status quo, right? You don't have to kick up a fuss, but the status quo is damaging just by being the status quo in many cases. So yeah, I think more fuss should be kicked up. It shouldn't be the default of keeping it there can be very harmful.
Yeah, there's no shortage of bad art, for sure. In the city of Dayton, there was a sculpture that was donated as part of a riverscape development, and it's aptly referred to by most people as 3 little kids on Prozac. It's just the kind of weird eyes and stuff that they have as they're playing. So there's something about melting or tearing down statues that implies a moral decision, coming down from the mountain and destroying the golden calf. I can see why groups might not want to admit that they have false idols and instead dig in. Where is there space for changing more minds and entering into a dialogue into such an oppositional political climate? Does melting just lead to boiling?
I do want to point out to counteract that, we have Chicago once melted down a statue of Christopher Columbus from Grant Park in the 1890s, but just because they put it up and everyone's like, that's a bad statue, try again. So they melted it down and recast it into a statue of Grover Cleveland that's now up. And then a couple of years later, commissioned another artist and put another statue of Columbus up. So sometimes it's just change. I think, yeah, there is this idea of melting as particularly violent, which makes sense, right? We see things that are done to figural representations as somehow our lizard brains, like, that's a person you're doing that to. But, it happens. A talk I gave at the Getty Museum last year was looking at the Romans as examples for what to do with unwanted statuary. So they recarved them, they junked them, they reduce, reuse, recycle of statues all the time. So again, I think because it hasn't happened so long, we think of it as a much bigger deal than it is. But also, if you think about historic buildings that go down, just historic artifacts, all the time are wearing out, being replaced. And we mostly don't think of that, often because replacement, there's a replacement, right? Something else goes up and then we think of, oh, that's the thing that should be there. That's the thing that celebrates the new regime that's in power versus the old one that went before. And so destruction happens all the time, and also destruction happens to things that aren't valued as much. So something that makes me riled up is how much public money is spent on the preservation of these type of monuments when there are sites of Indigenous and Black history just crumbling for want of preservation funds. So it's always, it's not like we can decide destruction or not destruction. Destruction is always happening. It's what are we continuing to preserve? And when I went to Atlanta to see Stone Mountain, I also visited on the same day this historic cemetery that holds the Confederate dead, which is beautiful, manicured, amazing, and Piney Grove Cemetery, which is a historic Black cemetery, which is, I didn't even know I was there. I kept wandering through the trees of this forest in between condo apartment buildings until I tripped over a gravestone, because it has been abandoned, not by the community. The church blew down during a hurricane, and then the land was sold. So there's really not access to it anymore. But yeah, destruction is happening. Who do we preserve is, I think, a better question than who do we destroy.
Yeah, I just kind of want to, just to follow up to that one, just because I know you showed the reaction from Tucker Carlson, and I'm sure that the kind of comments that were showing up on there were ranged from very incredibly vitriolic and not too much probably on the positive side. And I was just curious as to how you responded to that, knowing that the experience that we had when we worked on the George statue and the absolutely hateful kinds of responses that we were getting, and just how you felt about that, how you dealt with that.
Well, first of all, I instantly subscribed to Delete Me, which I highly recommend. It's a service that goes and searches for your public information to make sure that people can't find like your phone number, like some people did and were calling me. That was a little worrisome. I had a friend who posted something similar, who got visits from the FBI, being like, are you actually planning to take down monuments? She's like, no. And they're like, all right, we didn't think so, but we're just gonna leave now. But once I did that, I wasn't too worried. I was more energized by these comments. But again, it's very positional, right? Yeah. I figured, all right, I am someone who can afford the sort of unrest of occasionally worrying whether somebody will show up, but they're not going to show up because I'm a white tenured professor in America. Versus I know many activists that I have talked to who are differently positioned are much more rightly worried for their personal safety. So I thought, okay, I want to write about this in a way that's not trying to tell other people's stories for them, but is using the privileges I have to become a public voice, as one of the many public voices, but in a way that I can take some of this blowback and learn from it without engaging in it. I certainly wasn't replying to any of the tweets. In fact, some of the people tried to be mean about my appearance. Someone was like, I didn't know Rachel Maddow had a twin. And I was just like, really? Oh, was he having a good hair day? Like the New York Post did an article on like professor advocating for removal of statues, and they illustrated it with a selfie that I had posted because I thought I had like look good in my new pair of glasses. Like, what? I guess they wanted to show I was frivolous or whatever. I'm like, all right, you want to spread around how good I'm looking? Thanks.